What's up, guys? Today's video is super exciting. I'm finally building the 2JZ engine for my E36. So we're just going to get right into it. But before we do that, make sure you subscribe and hit the like button so you can follow along the progress with this build. So we've got two engines here. We've got the VVTi 2J out of a 2000s IS300. And then we have a non-VVTi out of a 90s SC or GS300. Now our goal here is to make 500 horsepower. So we want the VVTi for better low-end torque, but the VVTi engine is limited to like 350 to 400 horsepower because of thinner rods in the bottom end. So to solve that, we have the non-VVTi, which has stronger rods. So what we're gonna do is take the head off of the VVTi and put it on the bottom end of the non-VVTi. So the first thing we need to do is take off the head from the VVTi engine, so let's get to that. Okay, so I'm not going to walk you guys through how to take off every single nut and bolt. I'm pretty sure you can figure that much out. So we're going to start with the intake manifold. It's two halves. We've got the top half and the bottom half. You have to take the top half off to be able to access the bolts to take the bottom half off the head. So once we have the top half off, we can get to the bottom half and pull that off along with the fuel rail. And once I have them off, I like to put them back together. And anytime I take off a nut or a bolt, I try to put it back where it came from if possible. That way you don't have to keep track of it and where it goes. So after we take off the intake manifold, then we can start taking off the covers. We're starting with the front plastic cover or top plastic cover, and then we will take off the valve covers. It's important with these valve covers, they're only little 10mm bolts. Make sure you break them loose with a wrench first, because if you try to just impact them off, you'll break one off in the head like I did, and then have to fix that, which is not going to be fun. So break them loose with a wrench, and then you can zip them off with the impact. Then you can take off each valve cover and see the cams underneath. After that, we're going to move on to the front timing belt cover. It's got 3 Allen bolts. The one in the center is pretty deep in there. You can't just use a regular socket, so if you don't have a T-handle or a long Allen socket, you can just stick a Allen wrench in there and turn it with a crescent wrench. And then you can access the one on the right side through the pulley if you don't want to take the power steering reservoir off first. Or you could just take the power steering reservoir off and then access this. Pull that off, and then we'll be able to get to the bolts underneath it for the serpentine belt tensioner. So we'll take those 3 bolts off, pull off the tensioner. Then we can start working on the power steering reservoir. Most of the bolts can be accessed either through the pulley holes or underneath it. Just get all the bolts off, yank that off. Next, the AC compressor. It's pretty simple, just a few bolts, pull those off. And then we'll take off the water pump pulley because it's in the way of the lower plastic timing belt cover. And next we're going to break loose the crank bolt, which is the funnest part of the entire 2JZ disassembly. It is ridiculously hard to pull these, or to break these crank bolts loose. They're torqued to like 260 foot-pounds, and you know, over time they sit there and get corroded and rusty, and they do not like to come off. So I put a pry bar across the back between 2 of the flywheel bolts and then across the engine stand to keep it from moving. And then I'm actually using a piece of roll cage tubing with a 3/4 inch breaker bar with a 1/2 inch, with a 3/4 to 1/2 inch adapter and a 22 mil socket. So after struggling with it for probably about 45 minutes, I finally got it broke loose. I bent a bunch of flywheel bolts in the process. One tip I will give you is to try to tighten the flywheel bolts as much as you can, get them almost all the way into the crank, and that'll reduce the likelihood of them bending. You really don't want to damage the threads on the crank where the flywheel bolt's in, so be careful when you're using a pry bar to hold that in place. And you can see here how I have my pry bar between two of the flywheel bolts. They're tightened in almost all the way, which barely lets them stick out far enough to catch on the pry bar, but it did work just like this. Okay, so we're going to take a pause right here because the next thing we need to do is set the timing of the engine. You need to do this before you take off the cams so that you know they're in the right position when you unbolt them. So I have a cutout here from the service manual, and I'll provide a link in the description so you guys can access this entire service manual for yourself. But basically, you're going to set the timing to 60 degrees BTDC. So if you follow the instructions on here, basically you've got a timing mark and a sub-timing mark on the crank pulley. You're going to set the main timing mark to 0 and then make sure that the cams line up. Once you have the main timing mark on 0 and the cams lined up, you then turn the crank counterclockwise until the sub-timing mark is on 0. And then you're set. That's what you want before you take off the cams. After we have the crank bolt out, we can use a crank puller. This is just a generic puller that you can get at O'Reilly's or Advanced Auto Parts or whatever you have. And I used the 2 longest intake manifold bolts to bolt the puller to the crank pulley, but those are actually too long, so then I just used a lug nut as a spacer. So we pulled the crank pulley off. After that, we can remove the lower plastic timing belt cover. Next up, we can remove the hydraulic timing belt tensioner. It's just 2 bolts, and that pulls out, and then the actual tensioner pulley, you can push that down and out of the way to relieve pressure off the belt, and that'll make taking the belt off a lot easier, which I forgot to do, so it took me a minute or 2 to get the belt off, but no big deal. Okay, so now that we have the timing belt cover off, or the timing belt off, we can remove the VVTi solenoid. It has a oil feed line with 2 22mm banjo bolts. Just take those 2 bolts off and then you can pull the feed line off. Once you have the feed line off, there's just a 10mm bolt at the top, and then you can pull the solenoid out. And put the bolt back where it came from so you don't lose it. After we have the VVTi solenoid off, we can move on to the cam gears. You can see I'm using a crescent wrench to hold the cam. There's a hex-shaped spot on the cam specifically for that. Some people like to just loosen these bolts while the timing belt is still on. That may work for you. I did it this way. For the VVTi cam gear, you've got I think it's a 14mm Allen, or maybe it's a 12mm, but that's just a plug. So you remove the plug first, and then underneath the plug you'll find a 10mm Allen that's the actual bolt to hold the gear to the cam. So you'll take that off, and then you can take the cam off. Once you have both cam gears off, then you can go ahead and take off the back plate. And now you're ready to start taking the cam caps off. You're going to start with the first 2. The VVTi side has 4 bolts, the non-VVTi side only has 2. After you've taken those 2 off or loosened them, you're going to loosen the rest of the cam caps in a certain order, and here's the order right here. And you want to make sure that you take these off in steps or increments. Only loosen each bolt a little bit at a time, like maybe 3 turns. So start with 1, loosen it 3 turns, and then 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. until you get to 12. Then come back to 1, do another 3 turns all the way through 12, and then come back to 1 again, do a few more turns. At that point, it might be loose enough, it might not. You'll just have to just keep working at it until they're all completely loose. It's important that you do it in this order because the cams are under a lot of pressure from the springs. And if you don't take them off in the right order or try to take them off too fast, you could break a cam. So once we have them all completely loose, then we can take off all the caps. These caps are stamped with where they go. So E1 or E2 or I2 tells you if it's on the exhaust side or the intake side. Number 1 is the 2 outside caps where the seals are. So you'll see that the rest of the cam caps start at 2 and go up from there. So you won't have a number 1. After you have all the caps off, you can take the cams out. Sometimes they're a little bit bound up in there. They don't want to just pull right out. So just put a couple of your caps back on, hand tight, or even looser than that, and then just tap on them with a rubber mallet until they pop free. Then you can pull them out. Now that the cams are out, you can access the head bolts. The head bolts are a M12 spline drive, as you can see here. The one I have, you just use a 13mm socket on it. So we'll stick that in there and start breaking them loose. Just like the cam caps, it's important that you take the head off in incremental steps and start from on the outside and work your way in. So go from one end to the other and work your way towards the center. If you don't take it off in steps, you could warp the head as it lifts off the block. So I think you guys get the idea. Once you have them all completely loose, then you can zip them the rest of the way out with an impact. And then you can pull them out with a magnet, including the washer that goes underneath them. So just pull them all out with your magnet. Set those aside. Throw them in the trash because you're probably going to want to be using ARP head studs after this. After you have all those out, I forgot to take the water neck off the head. You don't have to, you can still take the head off, but it might be in your way when you go to set the head down on the workbench. So I went ahead and took that off, and now we can just lift the head right off. So now I have the head off the VVTi engine. I need to do the exact same thing with the non-VVTi engine. So I'm going to do that, and then we'll be ready to strip the block and get it ready for paint. So if you want to see how I do that, get it cleaned up and prepped for paint, make sure you stay tuned for the next video. So that's going to do it for this one. Thank you guys for watching. Thanks for subscribing, and we'll see you next time.